Welcome to this session of LitFestx. We're joined by Yasmin Khan, who's a British writer and a historian. Yasmin is currently an associate professor of history at the University of Oxford and is also a fellow of Kellogg College. Her first book was called The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, and her latest book, The Raj at War, was published very recently. Yasmin, thank you for joining us on LitFestx.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join you and have the opportunity to talk without having to actually come to India, although I would like very much to do that before too long as well.
Great. So, Yasmin, you've been writing a lot about refugees, and clearly this issue has somewhat come to the forefront again because of what's happening in the Middle East and Europe. And tell us a little bit about refugeeism as the world knows it now, from recent events and in history and in history.
And in history, I mean, at the moment, we're facing the greatest refugee crisis that the world has seen since the 1940s. And because I work on the 1940s and because I've thought quite a lot about refugees and their movements in the 1940s, particularly in Asia, it's really striking to me some of the commonalities and similarities that we're seeing now. Because the 1940s was a time of massive dislocation and displacement in Europe, as well as in South Asia. Of course, we know of partition, of the 12 million refugees who were displaced at partition, of these massive movements across from Pakistan to India and vice versa. But also the 1940s was a time of immense movement in Europe and in other places all across the Middle East, across China. There was about 60 million people internally displaced in China in the Second World War. I mean, it's just a staggering number if you think of it. But in Europe itself, Poles, ethnic Germans, obviously the Jewish people across the whole of Europe, but also in France and Spain, there were very, very major population movements. So I think that was the worst crisis that the world had seen in refugee terms. But we're now facing something again, which brings back those images of people trekking across, of having insecurity, not knowing where they're going to find a home. And we're seeing this with Syria, and the numbers are staggering again. 8 to 10 million people coming out of Syria. If you look at it as a percentage of the population, and you think of young, working, able-bodied people, it's the whole kind of working infrastructure of the country, the whole population, working population, young working population of the country is being uprooted. So it's a phenomenal crisis, and it's having repercussions, as you will know, in Europe and in Britain, where I'm based, because refugees are all over the newspapers constantly at the moment.
In many ways, this issue has led to the big vote in Britain, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, I think in Britain there's been a very deliberate muddling up in the tabloid news, in the tabloid press, in our newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Sun and so on. There's been a deliberate kind of muddling up of who is a migrant, who's a working migrant, who's coming to kind of find employment, who wants a different quality of life or wants to find a well-paid job, who is a refugee who is fleeing war and is coming from a war zone and is coming from a place where their life is in danger. And this kind of zone between these two things has been very muddy, very muddied. So people talk about immigrants, or they talk about refugees and migrants, and people aren't very clear, I think, about the distinctions between these groups. And there's also a real muddling up of the category of like EU citizen, which is actually a zone which involves free movement theoretically, and the movement from beyond the EU to the UK. So we've had some pretty horrible cartoons and characterizations of outsiders coming in. There was a cartoon in the Daily Mail which showed refugees coming across a border, with with rats running along their feet. And it was really derogatory. Lots of people compared it to cartoons that were being published by the fascist regimes, the Nazi regime in the 1940s about Jews. You know, so there's been some pretty horrible propaganda, and I think that has fed into this feeling of uncertainty and anxiety about outsiders and immigration in the UK, and which we've seen now in this vote to leave the EU, most recently in this referendum that we had last month to exit the EU. And I think this the Syrian refugee crisis is only a small part of that backdrop, but I think it's added to people's feelings of a world under siege and of a sense of people coming in from outside. Now, the reality, actually, in terms of Syrian refugees or refugees coming from the Middle East to the UK is actually very stark. It's very small numbers. Something like 5,000 have come and settled, have been allowed to come and settle so far, and given refugee status. So 5,000 is a drop, absolute tiny drop in the ocean. Nothing like what Germany is doing, nothing like what some of the other European countries are doing, and certainly not like what countries like India, Lebanon, and other countries do routinely when there's wars on their doorsteps, which is sort of trying to take people in, vulnerable people in. It's really complicated. It's not an easy thing to resolve or to settle. And I think there are always problems with integrating people who are coming in from outside. But
Right.
at the same time, we kind of become victim in the UK to a very unpleasant sort of discourse, I think, about refugees. In the 40s, there was some pride taken in helping people who had become victims of war. And I think that's the difference now. We're not seeing that. It's not being something that's being celebrated in that way.
So there is in a way a sense of protectionism of people's own turf and access to economic resources.
Definitely. And that's, it's inevitable at a time when resources are a bit tight. And it's inevitable at a time when, the UK's economy hasn't been as strong since 2008 as it had been in the past. But still, there's a sense of crisis around these things. And I think, when we look back to partition and that dreadful refugee crisis at that time, and you think how India and Pakistan were ultimately able to rebuild and to actually kind of help people build up their lives again, it's quite striking how the difference actually.
Clearly, the UK's thinking about refugees is very different now than what it was today. But let's switch over to India. India and Pakistan both have had to deal with refugees for a long, long time, and India has had several periods where refugees have been coming in. And what has been your sort of research in this area?
Well, I haven't done research directly. I haven't written any books or anything like that about refugees in the later part of the 20th century. I've really looked at what happened in the 1940s during the Second World War, and in 1947, particularly in the partition crisis, which is the greatest refugee crisis that South Asia ever has faced. But there have been other moments, very critical moments in the 20th century of South Asia. Obviously, the Tibetans coming in the 1950s, and India was very generous and very extended a lot of hospitality and space and infrastructure for Tibetans to make India their home at that time. But also 1971, of course, which was very serious and catastrophic. But India's also faced refugee movements coming from Afghanistan, from the Afghan wars, from Sri Lanka. But I think just the nature of being situated in the region as India means that it does tend to face the fallout from these conflicts, regional conflicts around it. But India's has been criticized for not being a signatory to the UN Convention on Human Rights. there's a 1951 convention on sorry, not on human rights, on refugees. There's a 1951 convention on refugees, and India has been in the past sometimes criticized for not having signed up to that. But I think actually, India has evolved its own policy and has been able to kind of accommodate refugees and has done. And it's funny looking at the history and thinking just how many people have kind of moved over the decades since independence. How many people have moved into the region.
So clearly a lot of the refugee movements have in history been linked to wars, and that's been the major reason. Give us some insights into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you look at the 1940s in South Asia, it wasn't just locally that people were moving. There were Poles, for instance, Polish people coming into India in the 1940s, because a lot of people thought that that when the war was raging in Europe, that South Asia was a safer place to be. And so there were Polish children and families who trekked right across, right across from Russia, right across through Central Asia, over mountains, turned up frostbitten, with malnutrition, with terrible diseases and so on, and came as refugees to India. And there were about 10,000 Polish people settled in India in the 1940s. The Maharaja of Jamnagar set up a camp for them, and there was housing for them scattered around in India. And you can find amazing photos of these Polish refugee camps with the children wearing national Polish dress and celebrating their Polish festivals. Some of them married locally. I think you may even still find some of the descendants of these families around today in India. So it wasn't just global conflict creates refugees who go all over the world, I suppose. But also in the 1940s, there was Burma, and those Indians who'd been living and working in Burma, who were caught up when the Japanese started to advance on Burma. And many thousands of Indians who'd been working in Burma in the mines or as plantation workers had to kind of pick their way across mountains, very high altitudes, terrible kind of leeches and malaria, and the stories are just harrowing of that experience. So I mean, I think what interests me in a way historically is when you look at what being a refugee, we talk about refugee in very broad terms as if it's just a category, but when you really look at those stories through history and what individuals have been through and their own reminiscences and their own recollections of the kind of bravery, but the destitution and the drama, the human drama of those episodes, it starts to make them feel like real people when you read about them in history like that. They're not just one big block of refugees that are not broken down and disaggregated into different groups. So I think there's some of the stories of what people have been through, the journeys that they have made, whether it's by land or by sea, on foot, the kinds of journeys that people make, the kinds of struggles that they go to try and keep their families together, the difficulties of children who've been separated from their parents. I mean, all these things are kind of universal things that happen in war, and they're happening now in Syria too. But they're things that happen again and again through history, I think.
Wow. Clearly there is a lot more to refugeeism than meets the common eye. And, like you rightly said, I think the general press and people at large are just referring to refugees as, one homogeneous group. And, but there are, lives, stories, childhoods which are lost there. And, in your book, you have talked about, in part, the partition as well, and how that led to refugees. And clearly there have been issues ever since in some form or the other. So how well or badly do you think that was handled, and could we have done things differently?
Wow, just a small question. Yeah, it's a very difficult and tricky question, isn't it? I mean, my feeling about 1947 and what happened, and about the refugee crisis, and that's what I write in the book, really, is that it was unanticipated. People wanted to create a new state of Pakistan. Many people and many people, agreed to that also. But I think all the people who were involved didn't anticipate just the scale of the refugee crisis, because it actually just snowballed. And I think people didn't foresee that. There hadn't been the planning put in place. People hadn't actually anticipated that. And humans seem really, really terrible at forward planning in these kind of situations. You can see that now again with Syria and what's happening all over Europe. The decisions get made, but then, like, what's the next step? How are we going to implement this? How is the plan going to be put in place? And I think that was where partition really, really unraveled, and this catastrophic refugee crisis started to happen. And on all sides, in Pakistan and India, the politicians started saying, this is nuts. This is crazy. We've got to kind of try and stem the tide of movement, because it's going to threaten our ability to function as states economically, socially. We're not going to be able to deal with this. So I think Mountbatten really is one of the people I would blame for the speed of the plan, and the lack of foresight, the lack of real kind of critical thinking about how is this going to work, what's it going to involve. And I think they could have looked at that point to Europe and to what was already happening in Europe about refugee movements, and seen what those crises would involve. And also, I mean, at that time, India didn't get any help from the UN or anything like that. I mean, they were outside of those international organizations, so they were really left with these problems to struggle with and to deal with independently.
Right. So your book has been out for a while now, and I'm sure you're onto your next thing. So what are you working on, and what can we expect in your writing?
I'm having a think still, and taking some time to enjoy reading and being able to actually think about other things and teaching and so on. But I'm really interested in doing a bit more work with the photographs, some of the photographs of the 1940s. One of the things that was a real pleasure when I was researching the book was finding old photographs of things happening in India in the 1940s, and lots of them have never been published. They've never been in exhibitions, and I think I'm quite interested in trying to just sort of organize some of those, or try and kind of collect some of those, and think about how they were done. I mean, there were a lot of soldiers in India in the 40s from America and from Britain who took up photography as a hobby. They had cameras with them and they were just snapping away. And so there's amazing kind of collections of images in some of the archives. And so it seems a shame to just leave them buried away in the archives without people seeing them. I think it would be great to bring some of them out of the dusty archives and sort of do something with them. And there was some really interesting Indian photographers starting to work in the 40s. I mean, some are very well known, like Sunil Jana, but there's others who were sort of amateur photographers who were doing really kind of coming into their own. And so I think I'm thinking about something along those lines, but it'll be a little while.
But it sounds very interesting, and I'm sure people will be quite curious to see that era and that side of those years, with foreign soldiers here, and how was the military in India sort of living up. So good luck with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for joining us. We come to the end of this session, and great to have you with us.
Thank you very much.